Sunday is the big day, the day thousands of Okanagan residents have been waiting a long time to see. That's when the official opening ceremonies will be held for the new William R. Bennett Bridge. Today we do begin a special series looking at the history of the Okanagan Lake crossing, beginning with life in the valley before the first bridge was built. Claudia Seglash has the story.
With its breathtaking scenery, a spectacular lake, and an enviable climate, the Okanagan Valley seemed to have it all.
Certainly people knew of the Okanagan Valley. They knew of this beautiful climate, of these manicured orchards that they lived in and drove through every day. And it was a pretty bucolic setting, pretty romantic in its own way.
But around the turn of the century, there was only one problem: the access to and from this piece of paradise.
There was no Hope-Princeton Highway, there was no Coquihalla Highway, there was no highway over to Alberta, so we were quite isolated.
Not only was the Okanagan isolated from the world, communities up and down the valley were isolated from one another, as the lake cut the Okanagan in half between Kelowna and West Side. Early settlers used dugout canoes to move goods and people. By the 1880s, a small flotilla of private vessels brought supplies and new immigrants to Kelowna. Then, a few years later, a small fleet of stern-wheelers, including the SS Sicamous, began plying the waters of Okanagan Lake and did so until the mid-30s. John Sugars, who's with the Okanagan Historical Society, was just a young boy in the 30s, but remembers life long before the notion of a bridge was ever floated.
These are the two ferries here. This is probably the Laquim, and this one would be the Pandosy.
The need to get vehicles across the lake spawned another form of lake transportation: the ferry. The Fintry Queen, which is now a popular tourist attraction and is anchored here in downtown Kelowna, was one of 3 overworked ferries back in those pre-bridge days that made the 10-minute trip from this side of the lake to the other.
It cost us a dime.
It was
10 cents. It was expensive, yeah. Yeah.
Per person?
Per person, yeah.
Expensive and time-consuming. Motorists were sometimes forced to wait for hours to get on the boats, creating traffic backups. But for merchants and orchardists, the crossing made life that much more difficult. Barges pushed by tugboats would have to take goods from Kelowna down to Penticton to be distributed throughout the rest of the province and Canada. It wasn't an efficient system by any means, and frustration was starting to set in. So much so that people began taking matters into their own hands.
And they took pick and shovel and they went to work to build a road down to Penticton on the east side.
Determined to improve the link between the central and south Okanagan, masses of people started building a road on the east side of the lake. Men and women devoting their own time to make it happen. But then came World War II, and efforts to complete the route were abandoned. But in the early 1950s, a Kelowna businessman became Premier of BC, the legendary W.A.C. Bennett. And what he had in store for the Okanagan was about to change everything. In Kelowna, Claudia Seglash, CHBC News.